I'm so tired of Zoom though, and the
We
platform.
are we are now live.
Oh, I'm
Yes,
sorry.
you're good, Rachel. Hi. You know, kind of that surprising little piece there. So,
Mhm.
hi, I'm Sable Schultz, she, her pronouns. I am the director of the transgender services at the Center on Colfax, and this is our Read It or Don't group. One of the things that we have started doing at the Center on Colfax is opening up our programming with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like everybody to take a moment with me and take a breath. We acknowledge with respect that the Center on Colfax stands on the unceded traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. We recognize Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and honor their sacrifices and hardships. We recognize that colonization is a current and ongoing process. Learn more at native-land.ca. Thank you. And so, for those that have been here before or for that are new, this is the Read It or Don't group book club. And the goal with this book club was to provide an environment where folks could talk about the book if they've read it or learn a little bit more about books that they may not have an opportunity to have read yet. We'd like to thank Denver Public Libraries for their sponsorship of this event and being able to provide and make sure that everybody has access to these books. This month, we are looking at Janet Mock's Surpassing Certainty, What My 20s Taught Me, in which Janet Mock talks about her experiences with some of her first relationships, going to college, and sort of recognizing the power of visibility in her life. With us today, we have Maya Rothland. Maya is a community organizer, advocate, activist, and proud trans woman of color. She is from Southern California and has found her home in Denver. She was a speaker and helped organize the March for Trans Rights last summer. She is currently working with Denver and working between Denver and Redding, California, with community organizations and is a chairwoman for the NORCAL Outreach Program, so NorCal Outreach Program, project advisory team, as well as co-facilitator of Gender Quest. And also with us is Rachel Esters, who is a retired law enforcement officer, TEDx speaker, and board member at One Colorado, and interpreting for our deaf and hard of hearing communities today, we have Kendra. Thank you all for being here. And I just want to open this up by giving our audience a little bit of understanding of some of the work that Maya and Rachel do. So Maya, do you want to tell us a little bit about the work that you do and how people might be able to get involved if they were interested?
Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Rothline, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm really fortunate and very thankful to be with you all this evening. So, some of the work I've been doing has been in the Northern California area right now. My partner and I, we recently decided to move to Redding following her work, and also there's a lot of advocacy work to be done here. It's a more conservative area in Northern California, and there's a lot of voices that need to be heard and a lot of things that we can do to help improve that. Through my time with NorCal Outreach Project, we've been working on a few different things. One, we do a lot of outreach to the full community. So we are a full LGBTQIA plus nonprofit. We also have a lot of different services that we do similar to the center in Denver. So we provide different groups for people to come to, as well as we give the opportunity to have like fun events. Right now, we're planning Who Let the Queers Out. It's a drag fundraiser show that we're doing at this at our center located in Reading, and it's going to help bring our center back into the spotlight and really kind of reintroduce ourselves to our local community, which during these times, this past year has been really tough on people who live up here. I'm not going to be able to like kind of shade it, but there's a lot of Trump supporters out here and a lot of people who openly in the history of the town are very anti-LGBTQ. So it's very hard at times for a lot of people to live here. But with the work we're doing, we're able to really like bring some light and some real like voices to the people who live here, which is really important. Besides that, I'm also working with Gender Quest, which is a group where we let people come in weekly, and it's one of the few places that's safe for people who are trans and gender nonconforming within our community up here in Reading. So that's been really fortunate and awesome. I've got to meet a lot of new people, a lot of amazing people, and hear a lot of their stories as well, which has impacted me a lot personally. Being from the bigger city, not knowing the struggles that a lot of my rural community goes through has really been eye-opening and really kind of gives me some more fire behind what I do. Some ways to keep up with what we're doing right now is we do have a Facebook page for the center, as well as we do have the option to donate with fundraisers because we are a nonprofit. So if you have like a birthday or hey, you're just trying to like raise awareness to something, we definitely have that option. You can go onto Facebook, look up our organization, as well as tag us in anything as well. We would love to have additional support from outside of the Reading area. But also people know that up here, we're also working really hard to protect the rights of our community. Coming up, I'm going to be working on the 14th of April and participating as a panelist in the Trans Abolitionist Visions. This is being organized with CU Boulder. It's basically, we're going to be talking about like people of color who are trans activists who are going to be discussing policing, incarceration, and different things about our borders. So definitely, I would say check it out. My social media has some information as well. You can look me up on Facebook under my name here, Maya Rothline, or I also am on Instagram with It's Your Girl Maya 27, and I'm on a few other platforms with the same name. So feel free to reach out, say hi, but hey, I'm always here and open. Even if you want to come out, talk, get resources, you can even send me a regular DM. I don't mind. I don't bite.
Thank you, Maya. Rachel, tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing.
Sure. When I retired from law enforcement, I went to work advocating for transgender people incarcerated in jails and prisons. I did quite a bit of work in the city of New York with the Department of Corrections up there to ensure that PREA was being properly instituted in the facilities. And I've done a little work here in Colorado on the behalf of transgender inmates in the Department of Corrections here in Colorado. When I retired, I started working for the Colorado Trust as an LGBT community connector. So what that involved is doing a research project out in western and rural Colorado on the challenges that LGBT people face and away from the metro area. Medical challenges, housing, the full gambit from kind of a health equity lens. This was through a series of focus groups and interviews over the last year, and we should be publishing that report sometime in the spring. I'm happy to be here. I think I might be one of the older people on the panel here today. So I have a little different lens of looking at the book. I'm over 60 years old, so some of the things in the book, I was in a different place. So I'm really interested to see how the book landed for other people. I'm happy to be here, and I'm raring to share.
Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and just skip in and dive right into some of our experiences with reading Surpassing Certainty. Rachel, what's something that really stood out for you in Janet Mock's book?
Well, there a few things come to mind. One of the things early in the book, she was talking about, and I'm going to spell it, MAHU, a term used in the indigenous community in Hawaii to describe people that might be seen as transgender. And what was really interesting to me is that it seems like in just about every indigenous culture, in fact, in every indigenous culture, there's a name, there's a place for transgender people, and that's absent in the Western cultures or the kind of the colonizer area. It seems that there's an acceptance of being, not only an acceptance, maybe even in some ways holding up people in this community in almost everywhere else except in this Western concept of civilization. So that really stood out to me, not just for the book, but just for our culture in general.
Oh, that's great. What about you, Maya? I know that you've mentioned that Janet Mock has been an inspiration for you. Or tell us a little bit about your initial feelings and reaction to the book.
Thank you. Yeah, so Janet Mock is somebody I definitely looked up to while in my beginning stages of my transition, as well as when I was younger before I even came out. Something that really stood out to me is a little bit on a different level. It's more or less her relationship with Troy. I really liked how she felt disclosure was such a big thing for her because she was so scared, because for a lot of people in our community, disclosing to people that you love, even finding love in the first place, is really hard. For myself growing up, that was one of the things that kept me back for so long, is because I never thought I would be loved for being myself, as well as being with my partner and transitioning with her, because she's been with me since the beginning. And being together before transitioning and having to disclose my truth to her is one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Luckily, we are engaged now and things have been great, but that's not the story for everyone. And I just felt that the way that she just is so vulnerable with her emotions and what she thinks could maybe happen, and also Troy's acceptance of her to an extent and being able to have that relationship. There's a lot of people within our community, even outside the community, especially with people who find love with us, especially cis straight men who, maybe don't disclose to people around them that, hey, my partner is an amazing trans man or woman. So just seeing that relationship, I feel a lot of people can relate to, but as well give visibility and show that not only is a relationship interracial, but also it's very progressive in the way that, hey, you have somebody who is an amazing trans woman who's with a cisgender man in the military as well, coming from that kind of brutish, manly culture. So I personally felt like that was one of my favorite pieces. Another thing I wanted to highlight was near the beginning of the book with Club New. She was, it's no secret that Janet Mock did necessary sex work to survive. In her previous book, Redefining Realness, she talks about being young, having to go through that, and having to have some things actually, on the internet, and having to progress with that. But also it helped her get her transition, pay for her surgery, hormones. And a lot of people in our community have to do necessary sex work, and there's such a negative stigma towards it that I feel like her being able to say, hey, even I did this, really does expose that to a wider audience. I'd like to go back to her description of Mama, the club owner. That was something that I really enjoyed. Just kind of her characterization, I could kind of feel like I have been there and I've seen her. And just the way that she goes from, I have to do this work to be able to pay for schooling, but also if anybody from my past comes up and discloses who I am or what I was beforehand, that could change everything and I could lose my job as well as face harm. So there's this thin line that she has to go through on the daily while working there and going to school at the same time, which I think is for me, seeing how hard she had to work to get to where she's at, it just inspires me to work even harder in my dreams as being, somebody who's a trans woman of color that can succeed. That's really tough within my community, seeing that type of success outside of like sports or music. So just, I personally felt a lot of inspiration from those parts.
I agree. Yeah, that's a lot of amazing pieces that that I pulled out of the book as well. To sort of like start then, that piece, Rachel, that you mentioned with other genders, sort of non-binary or other culturally appreciated genders, I think was a really, really key piece to Janet Mock's own personal acceptance in a way, and being able to see herself mirrored, at least in a not, a less colonized space, right? A less colonized identity, I think was a really powerful piece. And I know for my own transition, for me, I had to seek out historic and cultural references outside of white European colonized ideas of gender in order to recognize that I have a place and I have a path in this world. I'm not sure, have either of you two done similar or seen similar, sought out similar inspiration in your journeys?
I thought it was interesting. Well, I think it's interesting that what white supremacy in this culture has done with race, and I see a parallel. What Western civilization, white supremacy has done as it relates to gender. I wanted to go back to one of the things that Maya was talking about. This kind of this dual life. And here recently, I was in the military years ago, and I was connecting with people over social media, and it's always difficult because I'm connecting with people who I knew 40 years ago, and they don't know me as Rachel, and I'm doing that, and then and there's this fear that I'm not going to be accepted. So, regardless of what I've accomplished or where I've been or what I've done, but I'm not going to be accepted. And I did run into some of that. And I understand that's one of the themes through the movie. I mean, certainly Maya was talking about people coming into the club or people seeing her in different places. And then when she went to New York, not having the freedom to go somewhere where she didn't expect someone to see her. So I think that that's something that follows transgender people around to one extent or another. And it can very, very, very rarely is a positive experience. But most time we're waiting to see how this other person is going to react to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you I see you nodding your head, Maya, in terms of like Janet Mock, seeing that recognition in Janet Mock. Are there pieces that it parallels from your own life that you can see that dynamic happening as well?
Yes, as where she knew a little bit earlier on within her culture that was accepted. For myself, it was a realization very early on. I'd say about like some of my earliest memories from 2 or 3 years old, for me recognizing that like I am feminine, I am a woman, I am a girl. I didn't really have like the term for it at the time. So doing research, and the most that exposure I maybe had to that was in the negative way, but it was exposure anyway on like Jerry Springer, shows along those lines that had like the shock value. But being able to see that, whoa, the before and after, like this is possible, and there's people like me, made me feel a lot stronger in myself. In terms of having to kind of live that double life for a long time, I was very much like the jock, or like the very like cis straight man who was like Mr. Cool and Mr. Popular, spending time in front of the mirror for hours, remembering facial cues and things like that, just to make sure like I'm coming off manly, because not only within my own culture is there this need of taking away anything that's feminine or soft for people who are of color. Also, growing up like in the community I did, there was this additional, because I grew up in Valencia, California, which is like very much one of the safest places in the U.S., but it's predominantly white and there is a small minority of people who are of color, whether that be, you know, Black, Asian, Hispanic. There's very, and I mean, we're coming from a town where one of the biggest community organizers is a proud racist, and he's been, you know, quoted on Fox News saying so, Bob Keller. So with that being in mind, growing up, there's this internalized, I need to be Black, if that makes sense, having to find that, because a lot of like pressures put on you inside of that. So for myself, coming from this culture that it's not okay to be feminine, it's not okay to have softness, and I have to reinforce the fact that I am a stereotype, and kind of like that's the only way you get accepted within that predominantly white, you know, straight community. It does a lot to keep you from wanting to come out because there aren't those resources within that town. There aren't other people. Like visibility for me was very minimal until I got the internet, and then it was open season. I was researching everything, learning things about myself, and it kind of like came up with a game plan to come out later on in life. So just being able to see that representation, and then when she came out with Redefining Realness, I was, I believe, 18 or 19 when I read the book, and I found it on Google Books, and I kept it on my phone, and I was so happy because I got to read not only a story of a trans woman, but a trans woman of color, which there aren't many stories out there, especially at that time in book form, that I could like get that inspiration from. You know, with the introduction of social media and technology, and seeing like Reddit was really big for me. They have a few different subreddits, like One Trans Timelines is what I normally will recommend to people and myself, because like just seeing the before and after pictures meant a lot. And it showed that like if I take these hormones and I go through the steps to make myself happy, I can get there. So that's kind of like my experience with that, and seeing how I can grow and get inspiration from the visibility in front of me.
I'm glad you mentioned that visibility. I think that's lacking. It's lacking even inside the LGBT community. You know, every population, every group of people, every community needs to see themselves in a positive way. And I think when I think about transgender women, especially BIPOC transgender women, I think about a group of people that very rarely has the opportunity to share a voice, and then when our community is mentioned, often our story is co-opted by others for their benefit, and then positive representation is so narrow. We don't get that kind of positive representation, you know, that I think that we deserve. I was lucky enough to meet Janet once, and even to sit down and have dinner and to hear her speak. And she's quite a bit younger than I am, but there's this sense of power and regal dignity that kind of surrounds her. And when you're kind of in her orbit, you feel regal and this sense of dignity as well. I want an opportunity to say how much it means to have that representation, to have that person standing up there and expressing, you know, things that I feel inside and others feel inside in a way that's, you know, that's amazing. So that really, I went off on my Janet Mock tangent for meeting her, but I think that's an important piece is the representation and that we see in books like this.
Well, I'd like to add on that real quick as well when it comes to visibility, because being able to know her story, right? Even if you like just see the picture, the regalness is definitely real. And I'm glad that it goes through also from like seeing her pictures and video that like she is that amazing. But seeing that like her struggle, what she had to go through, going through sex work, going through to making it through college, getting, you know, sexually assaulted in school as well, which is something that I think was really important with myself with reading the book, is hearing her struggle with that and how she closed up. Now, I would like to say that the comment on what her struggle goes through for many people who are BIPOC, seeing how she was able to go through the sex work, which a lot of people do in our community, it's hard to get jobs, like when we are looked the way we are going through early stages with transition. It just shows you can get there. And that's so important for communities of color to have that representation to show that you can get there and be successful.
I think that's true, but I think at the same time, she makes a case for she has privilege, and
Yes.
a privilege that not all of us have, and recognizes that, because it would be, we go back to the story of America and, bootstraps and everybody just, knuckle down and everything's going to be okay. But I think she really recognizes that, so many people are starting in a hole, even more so than what she dealt with, and that the struggle is real. And in fact, those brown bag lunches that she had an introduction and some instruction on race that I don't think that she was aware of at that level. So I think that her friends did her a service by bringing that education and opening her eyes to things that she hadn't seen.
Oh my gosh, there's so many good points that you two have made. One thing that came up, especially when I was reading the book, was what you were talking about. Similarly, Maya, is that experience with predominantly white institutions. And Janet talks about that going to college in a way that I feel like she didn't have a typical experience as a Black trans woman. And I'd like to hear some of your reflection about either, Maya and Rachel, I'd like to hear your reflections on how she talked about that and how it relates to your own experiences.
I think that she was able to, when she got to university, her ability to pass really came forward. She didn't feel the need to disclose that information to anybody. And, being post-op, she had that ability to where in situations like in the book, even through like sexual relationships, meeting people and things like that, you would have never known. And I think that in a way that's great for her, but there's a lot of our community that have that unfair standard to there. Yeah. And for myself, like in my community, as that's a rural conservative community, in some areas I pass and some I don't. But to make sure that I'm always having visibility and representation, that I always have a trans flag on me. Whichever bag I have, I like to like accessorize myself, but make sure that I have those ways of being visible. And I'm very open about it as well. Because I feel like, yes, it's great that she was able to go through university and have like the typical, like, not typical because some bad things that happen, but have that like I'm just a regular girl experience. Whereas for somebody like myself, when I enter spaces, like I do sometimes get the looks. Or in my case, if I get clocked or something's wrong, like my life could be at risk because there have been people who have died in my community for being who they are. So there is a level where, yeah, it's great that she did that, but if she maybe could have been open, she could have inspired others on campus, or maybe could have highlighted, hey, I've come through so much as a trans woman. Let me give you my story. Meeting all her friends through school, having those relationships and opening up other people's minds. So I kind of think that overall, her experience doesn't really mirror mine because I don't really believe in the idea of passability, and I'm very open and forward that I am trans. Even if it's not up there, I'm just like, yeah, hi, my pronouns are she and her. And I think that's really important to own that.
Yeah, there's so many different transgender experiences, and they're based in, how we appear. They're based in our age and from where we come from. I want to honor all of those, especially especially the ones that are different than my own. One of the things that I took out of the book too is that so for me, growing up and I grew up in the Midwest and started school in the 60s in an all-white school in Omaha, Nebraska. So you can just imagine what that was like. And the only Black family in the neighborhood, and the only Black kid in school. So I was taught to you have to be the best. You always have to be the best. You can't be anything less. And I tell people, being a transgender person, being Black was my boot camp for being a transgender person. That I know I don't have. I have to be good. I have to be, because if I'm doing a job and it's a work, it's going to be graded as a B or a C. So I always have to be very good. And one of the other things, and this is not necessarily a book, that when I grew up, and you saw another Black person on the street, you said something to them. You acknowledged them. That was important. That was a thing, and that I don't see that happening so much anymore. I think that's important in our community, is for us to acknowledge each other and our experiences, and to recognize, how important it is for us to have that connection with each other. And that's so the events like this and reading the book and talking to Maya, these are the things that I take away more than anything, is this connection.
I think that's very true. The connection within all in our community, because at the end of the day, and especially being BIPOC, is that, we've made major strides within the communities of colors we come from, but there still is internalized prejudice. So even when white civilization, Western civilization, sees me as a negative, I don't have that, oh, I'm also Black, so I can come back to my community and they're going to support me, when that's not the case. In my experience too, especially in Denver, when I decided to be out 24/7 and be open about who I am, I actually got more discrimination from people who are Black, who were like, or you get the stare, or you get the, because they don't, and I feel like if we're in underrepresented communities, the more we're strong, the more we're connected, and the more that we all have faced levels of discrimination, you're on the same side. And there is that case of what you had mentioned earlier, Rachel, of the white supremacist undertone, that if you go into the community and you decide to internally divide, and we even see it within the queer communities, where there are some spaces where trans people aren't allowed, or where there are sections of the lesbian community that doesn't recognize us, or people who are feminists who don't want to include us in their movement. But if they don't realize together we are strong, and there are also these undertones of people who can go in there and kind of shake that up. You're seeing it now with sports. NBA won't talk about it. I'm a huge NBA fan, and I wish that we could see some level of representation on a higher level, where we're fighting for George Floyd. We're going out, we're saying Black Lives Matter, but Black trans lives matter as well. Trans lives in general matter as well. So, we are coming pretty far, but there's so much work to be done. There's so much that needs to be recognized, and people are kind of making it seem like a taboo subject in an extent. And if you were to see that recognized on a national scale, especially with the NBA, it could affect people of color. Dwayne Wade's been great with Zaya, being very open, being an amazing father, but you don't ever hear that come up. They never discuss it. I watch it every week. So that's just who I am. But I feel like for communities of color, to have that representation from your heroes, because when we grow up, we're told we can only become famous by music, being an actor, actress, or being a sports star. That's where we get the drive to be better than everyone else, because we're told when we're young, we have to be better. That's the only way we get to succeed in our life. So that's just what I like to comment as well.
I feel like a lot of the regulation that happens around gender in communities of color has a very sort of white supremacist dynamic, where folks are under so much pressure to adhere to gender expectations around white gender expectations, that then it almost can wind up leading into a backlash against people who are trans and gender diverse within those communities. Is that, how do you two feel about that, as a statement? Or
I think that's so super complicated.
Yeah.
Really complicated. I think, to go back to colonization, I think that there's the codes and laws that were brought in because of colonization, not just here, but on every continent, that that made certain behavior, certain people illegal, us to exist being illegal, or a violation of law. I think, and where they did that didn't exist before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that all those cultures are affected by that, including our culture in general. So that is the Black community going to be affected by that to an extent? Yeah, of course. I think all communities are going to be affected. Certainly the church has been no help. When I met Janet, she was speaking in a church and didn't want to necessarily speak in a church until actually having a long conversation with the church about how they felt about the LGBT community, and then she agreed to speak. Because the church, and in some cases, isn't always supportive of our community. That's something that we run up against as well. And certainly in the Black community, the church is a very powerful part of that community, and in a lot of positive ways, but sometimes it's not always as positive. In the LGBT community, and when I was doing my research, so we still have this racial divide within the LGBT community, and where we have a white LGBT community, and we have a BIPOC LGBT community, and that still exists. I can remember going to an event in Denver, an LGBT event, and the BIPOC room for the event. Everyone had a room, and was like tiny, like was someone's hotel room. Like you were sitting on the bed, where other groups were in palatial, were giving these wonderful suites and locations, and someone commenting, yeah, we're still on the back of the bus. And I think, honestly, we are still on the back of the bus as it relates to the LGBT community. I can understand maybe someone in the Black community has some confusion. It doesn't have maybe good resources in understanding my experience. But I'll be damned if someone in the LGBT community can't understand my experience and accept me. And it reminds me of when Sylvia Rivera got up on stage shortly after Stonewall and had a coming up speech to the crowd about how we were being treated, and that hasn't changed. Am I talking? Do you remember that speech?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, go ahead, Sable. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. This
hasn't changed. This issue has not changed. When I go, I know we're here to talk about the book, but when I go to an LGBT organization and I pull up the webpage, the first thing I do is pull up the webpage and see nothing but white people, and usually not a transgender person. So this hasn't changed, and until we can address this within our own community, we're going to have a difficult time bringing that case to the community at large. So again, with representation, I think that it's great that we're talking about Janet Mock, who's done so much, but I think that this is only a start. We need to do more.
I would like to add that on top of maybe some of the society, like justice side, or some of the government side of things, media as well within the communities of color. So if you think about like people who have become famous and people who are influential, right? They may not be an expert on the subject, but hey, they're getting their 15 minutes. A lot of it's derogatory towards women, and a lot of it's derogatory towards trans women. Because there's this thought of like, we're tricking, or that like we go back and forth, or that like our goal is to get here, shake it up, but we take the wig off in the morning. I mean, from my perspective, because I'm about 26, so through my formative years from 94 on, we only saw people who were trans who were like on TV being exploited, but I mean, they were getting income, but also it is he, is she, and it was usually with like a black guy with a beautiful black woman who's like, well, I have something to tell you. And then he's going to get up and be like, what? And then he may have a negative reaction, which for the most part usually always was. And then you just see that going forward. So like when people disclose like, hey, you know, I'm trans, or when that person goes, there was a person a few years ago in New York who was dating a trans woman, a black man of color, and he committed suicide because of like, it was videotaped, the abuse that he got just going through his own community when that was disclosed that like his partner was trans. I mean, you see the viciousness of the internet, but also like within our own community, I usually, and I hate to say this because I do like RuPaul to an extent that like we have that openness, but for a long time on the show, she was having she-male or really poking fun at trans people. And there was like this undertone that a lot of people and fans had to put an uproar of like, hey, trans people belong, contestants on your show are transgender, like you're offending people. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until like fan uproar, but then you see a icon within our community have to like expose themselves and look into themselves really hard and be like, hey, I need to be more accepting and make the changes I do. Which I think that, you know, I love that there's now a platform for people. Mm-hmm. And now we even see that, you know, within even the drag community, there was this divide of like, you're a drag queen or you're trans in drag, but like, there's not like this middle ground because like you went through and had the surgeries and things and can pass easier with your performances. Whereas I have to go through pads, through all this just to get there. And there's a lot of people who don't get to be themselves, who like compete, for example, like on TV, and then eventually afterwards, like they get famous because of the boy who does makeup on the internet, or because, you know, they can't be themselves beforehand to get to the platform. They have to kind of like go through this tagline of being like, I can do this and that to get to where they're at as well. So within like our queer communities, we get to think, okay, how are we not creating a place that's accepting for that person to just be themselves to start off with? Why does it have to be like, oh, this is a huge headline, somebody came out as transgender, and like, whoa, this is like, why are we doing that? It should be celebrated, but it shouldn't be used as like shock value. And if you think back to it, all these communities of color, like we're underprivileged in some areas. We don't have access to like certain medias. All we have is the TV. All we have is the hearsay around there. And if all the people are seeing on TV are these stories of like trans women who only do sex work and never get ahead, and it's a depressing life, or people dying, you know, having stories like Janet Mock's really kind of does show the lighter end of it, to where like, yeah, she did have some privileges, but the girl went through the struggle to get to where she's at. And that type of story is what needs to be out there. With her work on Pose has opened up our story to so many people. Even now, the Academy doesn't recognize the trans actors who are phenomenal on that story. I mean, I love that we got Billy Porter, and that like opens up the door to a lot of different representation. But like, to not give these actors and actresses their due, it still shows that divide in representation. And I think that because they're of color and they're trans, keeps them from wanting to promote that, because this civilization that we have doesn't allow people of color to be accepted unless you fit this mold. And there shouldn't be a mold in the first place. And if we keep that going into the communities of color, that you have to fit this mold to be accepted, you're never going to have true acceptance or a way to kind of bridge that gap, because we're constantly reinforcing this negative stereotype to trans women of color. So that's kind of like my 2 cents on that.
I think that those are, I mean, I grew up watching black men on TV being pimps, and the second banana, you know, we needed the white man to come through and figure things out for us. So representation is everything. And it's not just transgender people, it's the whole LGBT community. It's certainly everybody, you know, how we represent people and what children see. So what young people see when they grow up, is there either their opportunities or their limitations is what we're showing them. And Maya, you make the point, and I do think we need to uplift people, especially who are giving back to the community, like Janet Ma, uplift people like this, and really show, you know, how much they've done for all of us, you know.
sort of to shift topic a little, one of the things that I got from the book is, in a way, just how every day Janet Mock's life was after transition and surgery and all that, right? Like, yes, she was a sex worker, and then she proceeded on to other work, and she went to college and university, and it seemed very normal. And in a way, I appreciated that out of the book, right? Like, not to give out any big spoilers, but there's the trauma she experiences is not exclusive to trans folks. It's not trans specific trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned earlier, Maya, she had a fantastic relationship with her boyfriend. There are areas where I'm like, Janet, what are you doing? What are you doing? Right. But overall, it was a good relationship. She had a pretty good experience in college. I don't know, how does that speak to either of you two?
Well, one of the things, and I'm this is going to be terrible. One of the things that I see though is that it felt like her relationships what validated her. So it felt like she needed those relationships with those men to validate her. And I would have, if this were a fiction, I would have wanted my heroine to not need to be validated by someone else, to, especially as amazing as she is. But it shows how fragile we all are. You know, I think that we can all find a parallel in our life where we're using something or someone or something to validate our own existence. I would love to say I've never done that. I've never been in that situation, but I think that that would be a lie.
Yeah, I also agree with you. You know, but I think that that's also so essential to the story as well, though. And I say that because with her going through this idea of stealth, going through her life post-op without, disclosing, some people know, but to the wider world, having that regular experience, it allows us to analyze the work and poke that, what you said, see that, hey, we shouldn't put everything into our relationships. That doesn't define us. And I think that, of course, that helped her journey become the woman she is today. But I think that also maybe finding, the true thing is finding that inner strength in yourself, your inner worth, and how we can maybe make that easier for everybody else and maybe normalize that. Because a lot of people in our community think that I have to go through, especially for those who grow up in her situation where, like, I was, in school, and she transitioned early on in school. So there's like that extra layer of, like, I didn't experience that. I transitioned after school, but she did it while in school. So nobody was like physically, like, they could have been attracted to her, but there was never that like openness and willingness. And during her early sex work in her first book that she talks about, the only type of attention she gets, and she touches on it in this book, was from people who wanted, the quick rub and hug, who wanted to have sex or wanted that. So that was like the only time she felt her self-worth. Because growing up, she was demeaned, going through school. I can only imagine, besides what she features in her story, the outside influences and just things that people can say, because kids are mean. Like, that's just the teachers know about it. Bullying is a huge issue. And I think that maybe if she didn't have that bullying earlier on, or maybe if it was more normalized to have relationships with people who are trans, then maybe like she could have maybe changed where her self-worth came from. If that makes sense. Because then when she grew up during that time, like, most women saw their self-worth was being in the relationships with their man, and that wasn't really normalized outside of that. Like, you just were like, I'm at my woman status once I'm with a man and I'm able to be taken care of, and once I'm in love. And that's where a lot of people, even nowadays, cis and trans, find a lot of their self-worth. And, it takes time to find that internally. But I think that also, like, her background and her story and what she had to go through, her struggles, kind of shaped that portion of it.
Yeah, I think we should celebrate really any transgender woman who is still walking around and moving forward with that weight on their shoulders. I think that that in itself is a celebration every day to move forward. And not all of us will be novelists, and not all of us will be. Sometimes the celebration is just that we got paid, or we made it home, and
Yeah.
yeah.
I like to, and I love that you brought that up because that is important. Just being able to wake up in the morning, show your light. Because just like going, like myself, going to the store, somebody's gonna see me. I'm not super like stealth or very passable. And if you know anything about our special colors on our flag, you go stop me immediately. But for that teen who's like, I can't tell that to my parents. They see me and they go, wow, like you're out there, you're proud, you're not hiding your face, you're walking with your head up, you have a partner, you have a ring on your finger. Like I can do that. And I feel like if I would have had that growing up, like that would have been great. And I think that goes on to like something we were kind of talking about earlier, which was like what can we like topics talk about within our community? The stories of people who live a regular life. Like we idolize those who have like succeeded and are movie stars, directors, writers, sports stars. But what about like the regular person like you and me? I feel like if those stories were more accessible, more people could be like, okay, like this is normal. Like I can just live my life and achieve, but it doesn't have to be like this out there extravagant lifestyle. Not everybody wants that. Like that's not something I'm personally looking for. And just having people who have that type of background and more or less showing those stories can do a lot. Everyday life is important. And it needs to be championed that you're alive today, and just being able to show somebody a story of like, here's a trans woman, trans man, somebody's gender non-conforming living their life can go really far. Not only does it help the person who's maybe questioning or helps, validate somebody's existence, because unfortunately in the world we live in, we have to have validation. And for a lot of people who are transitioning, until they feel valid, they can't personally like when you transition, you give up almost everything. There's a 50-50 chance that everybody you know or will contact you will either like you, discriminate against you, or you'll be loved. And that's not the case for everybody. And there's a lot of negative consequences that come from it. But you're being selfish and taking in your own. And I just think that like if we were able to spotlight that with different people of color, different backgrounds, and like letting their stories be known, we'd be able to inspire a lot more people to be themselves and to find that light.
I think so as well. I know for myself, I came out in the late 90s, and in order for me to find that space to do so, I had to find stories of other folk, other trans folk, other trans women. I was fortunate, right? I had access to the internet at a time that not everybody did. And so I was able to find these stories on the internet. And again, a lot of it was the everydayness of the experience, because we've mentioned seeing these sensationalized stories of trans folks on talk shows, right? And so much of that is about the extreme of those situations. And so I couldn't relate until I saw stories about people saying, this is my life, that I have a partner, these are the sorts of things that I do, right? Like those pieces, almost that we're just everyday folk.
And I could not, when I transitioned, I didn't see the stories of people who look like me. And I didn't see those positive representations. And, my introduction was being in DC and the police wanting to stop me because I was just walking across the street, because I was just existing. And so not seeing those representations, nobody looked like me. Nobody, there weren't, you were in a closet within a closet within a closet. And I know we're talking about representation again, but it's just so important that we have this representation. And what Maya said, it really is about normal people. And honestly, for most of Janet's life, very normal person, an achiever, but a normal person. And we do need to hear those stories. We need to see those stories more.
Definitely ambitious for sure. So when it comes to topics related to our our community and stories related to our community. Who do you two like? And whoever wants to start, who do you go to for your stories?
I go to, for a lot of the stories that I personally, I do like somebody who I've enjoyed over the years, and I'm reading their novel right now, Gigi Gorgeous. I mean, it's definitely from another spectrum, and I wanted to see like that perspective of somebody who has a possibility, who's also not of color, white, and just kind of seeing like what their confidence comes from, because they come from a different upbringing than I do. So for myself, like her story was very interesting to me because it was like, hey, this is, somebody who came out as one of the beauty bloggers on YouTube and now has like a brand and industry, and it's kind of like making their own waves. But I really go to Ryan Murphy. I think that Ryan Murphy in general has given like so many underrepresented people a chance to shine when it comes to casting on TV shows. We see Angelica Ross not only be on Pose, where she's an openly trans woman, but also like on American Horror Story. Like that opens up with even the company FX has done to giving people of color, but also trans people of color, representation in a wider spectrum. Like that's big because most people get most of their medium and like resources from TV. So like for myself, there's going to be a whole generation of people growing up seeing like Pose, seeing American Horror Story, watching 911, watching all these shows that are made by Ryan Murphy, where you can spot yourself, like you can see yourself in those shows. And I think that like that's one of the reasons I love him, but also like that's where I go to for that content for a lot of things.
Yeah, I have. I'll cite two things. I have a friend who's a retired police commander in Chicago, and he's a black man, and he is always been very supportive of me, and as a friend, and always very supportive when I didn't think he would be. I don't come from a profession that's typically very huggy-feely. And so I find this support coming from him. He lives across the country. We talk on the phone. And the other place I found support. So when I was growing up, I had no examples of anything. I didn't have words. There was nothing. And I always kind of fell into reading science fiction because it was the one place. My world was so jacked up. It was already hard enough being black, okay? And then I had this other thing that the only way that I could find, some solace is in a book. And I typically found that the sci-fi geeks and nerds like me imagine worlds that are different than this one. And so that's where I found my place to be by myself, because I was always a community unto myself.
Is there anybody that you like today, Rachel, that you've been reading? Any science fiction authors that you would point out to?
Yeah, don't do that to me.
Okay. I'll be nice.
Right. As soon as we get off, I'll have a whole list for you.
Oh, okay.
But I find that there is more imagination. There's more willingness to understand gender in a different way, and that one other thing that I like anything that I like to read things that I can connect with other people and know that they felt the same way I did, maybe 600 years ago or whatever. If I'm reading something that is historical about people who are transgender, who are identified differently, I saw a story the other day about a Hawaiian story, a kind of a myth story, mythological story, and to identify with those people made me feel strong, and made me the fact that someone had thought up that story that was based in something. So I've always been alone. So those are the things that somewhere I try to read or see those things, and then hold those close to me.
Right. So as we get ready to wrap up, I wanted to ask you two again how folks can get involved in some of the work or organizations that you're working with. Who wants to start off?
I'll go ahead and start off. Just a reminder, I do, of course, want to put out there that there are, besides living in Denver, there are rural communities that do need, the help, the funding, the support of outside communities because there isn't that internal support here. So with my work with NorCal Outreach Program, I definitely want to put out, I would love people to not only go to our site, go online, read a little bit about us. Also, if there is any way to help financially with running fundraisers on Facebook, putting the word out there that hey, rural communities do need the help when it comes to fighting for the rights of everybody that lives here, as well as being able to provide resources to those that need it as well. We do food banking, from being able to provide groups, being able to also provide resources and counseling, which is really amazing. And I really feel as if, we're able to fully embrace the other side of things, which is, outside of the city, that there are people who are in these areas that need help, especially in even broader from who I work with. Let's go out and look into the communities that need it within the South, who need it more than we do, or those who are in Arkansas, who are constantly working to try to progress, just getting basic rights. I think right now we're at a pivotal point where our voice means something. And I think that as a community and people in general, we have to be putting in the time to help progress areas that don't have the type of privilege we do. If you're in the Denver area, not only can you transition, but if you have Medicare or Medi-Cal, whatever I think it's Medicare in the area, you can transition with Denver Health, who is one of the top in the whole world, actually in the United States, for giving gender affirming care. Whereas if you go to these other communities where you have, myself, I have to travel an hour and a half just to get healthcare. Or do you look into communities in the South where you have this now red wall of you can't even help somebody who's young, can't get counseling, you go to jail if you give gender affirming care. So I think that as a community, we need to really go towards putting our first foot forward, calling our senators, calling the governors, calling those who are in charge. And even if it's social media activism, sharing something on your page, your friends list, see something that's actually riveting to them, it can change somebody's idea and open up that discussion and open up into a bigger mind frame and acceptance for the trans community. So that's what I'd like to leave with.
Definitely. Rachel?
I'd like to see us, all of us, hold organizations like the one I serve on the board with, the One Colorado. I'd like to see people hold our feet to the fire and make sure that we are taking care of the entire community and other giving and funding organizations to ask if they are doing things for the LGBT community as well. And as an individual, I think in today's world, between the pandemic and between the killing of Black people by law enforcement, I think that if you're not doing something today for someone, then you're part of the problem.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you to our audience. Thank you, Kendra. Please like and subscribe if you appreciated this video, and check us out. Check out our site. And thank you again to Denver Public Libraries and Second Star to the Right for sponsoring this series. And thank you, John. I think we're out.